The morning started like any other at Kensington Palace. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood by the large window in her private study, watching the early sunlight paint the gardens in shades of gold. She held a cup of tea in her hands, but it had gone cold. Her mind was somewhere else entirely. The weight of the past few months pressed down on her shoulders like an invisible burden she could not shake off. William had left early that morning for an official engagement. She remembered the way he kissed her forehead before leaving, lingering just a moment longer than usual. There was something in his eyes that morning, something she could not quite name. Worry, perhaps, or maybe it was the exhaustion they both felt but rarely spoke about. The palace staff moved quietly through the halls, their footsteps barely audible on the polished floors. Catherine set down her teacup and picked up her phone. There were dozens of messages waiting for her attention, schedules to review, events to prepare for. But she found herself staring at a photograph instead. It was from years ago, taken during a private holiday in Scotland. William was laughing in the picture, his arm around her shoulders, both of them looking genuinely carefree. She wondered when they had last felt that way. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Margaret, one of her senior aides, carrying a folder of documents that needed her signature. The woman's expression was professional, but Catherine could see the concern in her eyes. Everyone around them had been walking on eggshells lately, treating both her and William with a gentleness that spoke volumes about what they all knew, but never discussed openly. Catherine took the folder and thanked Margaret, who quietly excused herself. Alone again, she sat at her desk and tried to focus on the papers in front of her. But the words blurred together. Her thoughts kept drifting back to William, to the conversation they had late last night when the children were finally asleep. He had held her hand across the table, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, and they had talked about everything and nothing. About fears they rarely voiced, about the future that seemed both certain and terrifyingly uncertain. The sound of a car pulling up outside made her heart skip. She glanced at the clock. William was not supposed to be back for another 3 hours. She moved to the window and saw his familiar figure stepping out of the vehicle, his shoulders slightly slumped, his expression serious. Something had happened. She could tell from the way he moved, the urgency in his stride as he headed toward the entrance. Catherine left her study and walked through the corridor, her heart beginning to race. She met William at the top of the main staircase. He looked up at her, and in that moment no words were necessary. His eyes told her everything. Something significant had occurred, something that would change the careful balance they had been maintaining. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step seeming to carry the weight of whatever news he brought with him. When he reached her, William took both of her hands in his. His grip was firm but trembling slightly. The hallway around them was empty, the staff having discreetly disappeared, giving them the privacy they needed. Catherine searched his face, trying to read the emotions that flickered across his features. There was sadness there and determination, and something else she recognized because she felt it too. It was the knowledge that some moments in life become turning points, markers that divide everything into before and after. William opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. He pulled her gently toward a small sitting room nearby, away from any possibility of being overheard. The room was quiet, filled with afternoon light that made the dust particles dance in the air. They sat together on the sofa, their knees touching, hands still intertwined. Catherine waited, giving him the time he needed to find the words. He began to speak in a low voice, telling her about a phone call he had received during his engagement. It was from his father's office, a conversation that lasted only minutes but felt like hours. The words tumbled out, each one landing like a stone in still water, creating ripples that spread outward, touching everything. Catherine listened without interrupting, her face growing pale as she absorbed the information. This was not unexpected, but expecting something and actually facing it were two entirely different experiences. As William spoke, Catherine felt her chest tighten. She thought about their children, about George and Charlotte and Louis, about the life they had built together within the constraints of duty and public service. She thought about all the carefully laid plans, the schedules that stretched months into the future, the appearances they were meant to make, the stability they had fought so hard to maintain for their family. And now, with just a few words, everything felt uncertain again. William finished speaking and looked at her, waiting for her response. But Catherine found she could not speak yet. She stood up and walked to the window, her arms wrapped around herself. Outside, the world continued as normal. Tourists gathered at the palace gates taking photographs. Cars moved along the street. Life went on, indifferent to the private earthquake happening in this quiet room. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes, allowing herself just a moment to feel the full weight of what they were facing. William stood behind Catherine, not touching her but close enough that she could feel his presence. She appreciated that he gave her space to process everything, even as she knew he needed comfort too. They had always been a team, navigating the impossible demands of royal life together, finding strength in each other when the weight became too much. This would be no different, she told herself. They would face this together, just as they had faced everything else. She turned around to find William watching her with an expression that broke her heart. He looked tired in a way that sleep could not fix. The strain of maintaining composure in public while carrying such heavy private burdens was showing on his face. She crossed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt his shoulders shake with a silent sob he had been holding back since receiving the news. They stood like that for a long time, drawing strength from each other in the quiet room. When they finally pulled apart, Catherine wiped a tear from William's cheek with her thumb. He caught her hand and kissed her palm, a gesture so tender and familiar that it made her eyes fill with tears again, but she blinked them back. There would be time for tears later. Right now they needed to think clearly and make decisions about what came next. The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls and meetings. Officials came and went, bringing updates and asking for instructions. Catherine sat beside William through it all, her hand never far from his, offering silent support as he dealt with the immediate logistics. She watched him transform before her eyes, putting on the mask of royal duty, his voice becoming steady and authoritative even as she knew his heart was breaking inside. This was what they had been trained for, she supposed. To put duty before personal feelings, to serve even when everything inside them wanted to crumble. Evening came, and with it the time to tell their children. George was old enough to understand some of what was happening, but Charlotte and Louis would need explanations appropriate for their ages. Catherine felt her anxiety spike as they gathered the children in the family sitting room. This was the part she had been dreading most. How do you explain complex, painful realities to young minds still innocent of the world's harsh truths? William spoke to them gently, his voice filled with love and reassurance. Catherine added details when needed, choosing her words carefully. George's face grew serious as he processed the information, asking questions that showed a maturity beyond his years. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, and she climbed into Catherine's lap, seeking comfort. Louis, too young to fully grasp the situation, sensed the heaviness in the room and grew quiet and clingy. They spent the evening as a family, keeping the children close, reading stories and playing quiet games. Catherine held Louis as he fell asleep, his small hand clutching her necklace. She looked over at William, who was sitting with George and Charlotte talking in low voices. Their family felt fragile in that moment, like something precious that needed protecting from the storm gathering around them. Later that night, after the children were all tucked into bed, Catherine and William returned to their private quarters. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken thoughts. William loosened his tie and sank onto the edge of their bed, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. Catherine sat beside him and placed her hand on his back, feeling the tension in his muscles. He looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes and spoke about his fears. Not the official concerns or the matters of state that had filled the day's conversations, but the personal, private fears of a son and a husband and a father. Catherine listened, her heart aching for him, wishing she could take away some of his pain. When he finished, she shared her own worries, the anxieties that had been building in her chest all day. It felt like releasing pressure from a valve, speaking these fears aloud in the safety of their private space. They talked deep into the night, making plans and adjusting expectations. They discussed how to protect their children while preparing them for what lay ahead. They talked about the increased responsibilities that would fall on William's shoulders and what that would mean for their family life. Catherine promised to be there for every step, to carry what she could, to be his partner in every sense of the word. William pulled her close, thanking her for being his anchor, his constant in a life that seemed to shift beneath their feet. As they finally lay down to sleep, exhausted but unable to rest, Catherine stared at the ceiling, thinking about the journey ahead. She thought about the young woman she had been when she first fell in love with William, how naive she had been about what this life would truly demand. But she also thought about everything they had survived together, the challenges they had overcome, the love they had built that was stronger than any obstacle. She reached for William's hand in the darkness, and he squeezed back, a silent promise that they would face whatever came next together. The next morning arrived too soon. Catherine woke to find William already up, standing by the window in his robe, looking out at the dawn. She joined him, slipping her arm through his. They stood in silence, watching the sky lighten, knowing that today would bring new challenges, new demands on their time and energy. But for this quiet moment, they were just two people facing an uncertain future, finding courage in their shared love and commitment. The following weeks tested Catherine in ways she had never imagined. The news that William had shared with her that afternoon soon became public knowledge, and the world's attention turned toward their family with an intensity that felt suffocating. Camera crews camped outside the palace gates. Newspapers ran endless speculation. Social media exploded with commentary, theories, and an overwhelming wave of public emotion that seemed to have a life of its own. Catherine found herself caught between two worlds. On one hand, she had to maintain the composed, graceful public image that was expected of her. She attended engagements with a smile, spoke to crowds with warmth, and presented a picture of strength and stability. On the other hand, she was dealing with her own private grief and worry, supporting William through his pain, and trying to shield their children from the chaos swirling around them. The exhaustion was bone deep, settling into her body like an illness she could not shake. There were moments when she wanted to scream, to tell everyone to leave them alone, to give them space to breathe and feel without the constant scrutiny. But she knew that was not possible. This was the bargain they had made when they chose this life, or rather when William was born into it and she chose to join him. Privacy was a luxury they could not afford, especially not now when public interest was at its peak. William struggled too, though he tried to hide it. Catherine could see the toll it was taking on him. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He threw himself into work with an almost desperate energy, as if staying busy could keep the darker thoughts at bay. She worried about him constantly, watching for signs that he might be pushing himself too hard. But when she tried to talk to him about it, he would deflect, insisting he was fine, that he had to be strong for everyone else. One particularly difficult evening, after a long day of public appearances and private meetings, Catherine found William in his study long after midnight. He was sitting at his desk surrounded by papers, but he was not working. He was just staring into space, his expression hollow. She approached quietly and knelt beside his chair, taking his hand in hers. He looked at her with eyes full of unshed tears, and finally let his carefully maintained composure crack. He talked about the pressure, the expectations, the feeling that he was being pulled in 100 different directions. He spoke about his father, about complicated family dynamics that the public never saw, about love and duty, and the impossible task of balancing both. Catherine listened, offering comfort where she could, but mostly just being present, letting him know he was not alone in this. When he finally stopped talking, she pulled him to his feet and led him away from the desk, insisting that what he needed most was rest. The days began to blur together. Catherine established routines to help maintain some sense of normalcy for the children. Breakfast together every morning when possible. Bedtime stories every night. Weekend activities that kept them grounded and connected as a family. She became fiercely protective of these small rituals, viewing them as shields against the chaos of their public lives. The children needed stability, and she was determined to provide it even as everything else felt uncertain. She also found herself leaning more heavily on her own family during this time. Her parents became frequent visitors, providing support and a connection to life outside the palace walls. Her sister offered a listening ear during late-night phone calls when Catherine could not sleep. These relationships, which she had always valued, became even more precious as she navigated the challenging waters of her royal responsibilities while dealing with personal turmoil. The public's reaction to the unfolding situation was mixed. While many showed tremendous support and sympathy, others were critical, questioning decisions and speculating about private matters they could not possibly understand. Catherine learned to develop a thicker skin, to not read every article or social media post, to protect her mental health from the constant barrage of opinions. But it was not easy. Sometimes a particularly cruel headline would slip through her defenses, and she would feel the sting of judgment from people who did not know her or her family at all. Through it all, her relationship with William deepened in unexpected ways. Crisis has a way of either breaking relationships or forging them into something stronger, and theirs was becoming unbreakable. They learned to communicate in glances across crowded rooms. They developed signals for when one of them was struggling and needed support. They found stolen moments throughout busy days to check in with each other, to offer encouragement, to simply be together even if just for a few minutes. Catherine also discovered reserves of strength within herself that she had not known existed. There were mornings when she woke up exhausted, dreading the day ahead, wondering how she would find the energy to fulfill all her obligations. But then she would think of William, of their children, of the people who depended on them, and she would find a way to get up and keep going. She learned that strength is not the absence of fear or pain, but the decision to move forward despite them. One particular day stood out in her memory. It was a public engagement that neither she nor William could avoid, despite both wanting nothing more than to stay home. As they prepared to leave, Catherine caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked polished and professional, every hair in place, her outfit carefully chosen, but she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. When had she become this person who could hide so much pain behind such a perfect exterior? William appeared behind her in the mirror, adjusting his tie. Their eyes met in the reflection, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Then he placed his hands on her shoulders and she leaned back against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. They stood like that for a long moment, neither speaking, both preparing themselves for what lay ahead. Finally, Catherine straightened, took a deep breath, and turned to face him with a determined smile. They would get through this appearance just as they had gotten through everything else. Together. The car ride to the engagement was silent except for the soft hum of the engine and the distant sound of traffic. Catherine sat beside William, their hands clasped together between them, hidden from the view of anyone outside. She could feel the tension radiating from him, could see the way his jaw was clenched as he stared out the window. She gave his hand a gentle squeeze, and he turned to look at her, offering a small, sad smile that did not quite reach his eyes. When they arrived, the crowd was larger than expected. Hundreds of people had gathered, many holding signs and flowers. The outpouring of public support was touching, but it also felt overwhelming. Catherine took a deep breath, released William's hand, and prepared to step out of the car. The moment her foot touched the pavement, the cameras began flashing, creating a disorienting strobe effect. She maintained her smile, waving to the crowd as she had done countless times before. William joined her, and they walked side by side toward the building where their engagement was scheduled. People called out to them, offering words of encouragement and sympathy. Some were crying openly. Catherine paused several times to accept flowers and speak to those who had waited hours to see them. Each interaction required her full attention, her complete emotional presence, even though she felt like she was running on empty inside. During the actual engagement, Catherine found herself going through the motions automatically. She shook hands, made small talk, smiled for photographs. Her body knew what to do even when her mind was elsewhere, wandering back to the children at home, to the conversation she and William needed to have later, to the mounting concerns that kept her awake at night. She caught William's eye across the room at one point, and she could see he was experiencing the same disconnect, present in body but distant in spirit. The breaking point came during a quiet moment between official activities. They had stepped into a private room for a brief respite before the next part of their schedule. Catherine sat down heavily on a chair, suddenly feeling the full weight of exhaustion. William stood by the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid with tension. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the things they were not saying. Catherine stood and walked to him, placing her hand on his back. He turned and she saw that his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. Without thinking, she stepped into his arms, and he held her tightly, burying his face in her shoulder. They stood like that, clinging to each other, two people trying to hold themselves together in private before facing the public again. Catherine felt her own tears start to fall, soaking into William's jacket, but she did not try to stop them. For this brief moment, they could be vulnerable with each other. A soft knock on the door signaled that their break was over. They pulled apart reluctantly, both wiping their eyes and trying to compose themselves. Catherine checked William's appearance, straightening his tie and brushing away an invisible speck from his shoulder. He did the same for her, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with a tenderness that made her heart ache. They took deep breaths in unison, then nodded to each other. Time to put the masks back on. The rest of the day passed in a haze. More handshakes, more conversations, more photographs. Catherine's face hurt from smiling. Her feet ached from standing in heels for hours, and her heart felt bruised from the constant effort of maintaining composure. But she kept going, kept performing, kept being the princess that everyone expected her to be. Beside her, William did the same, though she could see the strain in the lines around his eyes and the stiffness of his movements. Finally, blessedly, they were back in the car, heading home. The moment the doors closed and they were safely away from cameras and crowds, both of them seemed to deflate. Catherine removed her shoes and leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes. William loosened his tie and ran his hands through his hair, disrupting the careful styling. For several minutes, neither of them spoke, both too exhausted to form words. When they arrived back at the palace, Catherine wanted nothing more than to collapse into bed. But there were still things that needed to be done. The children would be waiting to say goodnight. There were messages that required responses. The demands of their position did not stop just because they were tired or emotionally drained. She forced herself to rally, to find one more burst of energy to get through the evening. The children's excitement at seeing them provided a temporary lift to Catherine's spirits. Louis launched himself at her, chattering about his day, and she scooped him up, breathing in the familiar scent of his hair. George and Charlotte were more subdued, sensing perhaps that their parents were struggling, but they still sought comfort and attention. Catherine and William gave what they could, reading stories and listening to the children's activities, trying to be fully present for these precious moments with their family. After the children were finally asleep,
Catherine found herself alone in the bathroom, staring at her reflection once again.
she looked exhausted, the careful makeup now worn away to reveal the dark circles under her eyes, the paleness of her skin. She thought about the woman she had been before all of this, and she wondered if that version of herself still existed somewhere beneath the layers of duty and responsibility she had accumulated over the years. William appeared in the doorway, already changed into comfortable clothes. He did not say anything, just held out his hand to her. Catherine took it, letting him lead her to their bedroom. They lay down together, not talking, just holding each other in the darkness. The weight of the day, the week, the month pressed down on them, but somehow being together made it bearable. Catherine listened to the steady rhythm of William's heartbeat and felt some of her tension begin to ease. She thought about the path that had brought them to this moment, all the choices and circumstances that had led to this life they were living. It was not the fairy tale that people imagined. It was hard and demanding and sometimes felt impossible. But as she lay there in William's arms, feeling the warmth of his body against hers, she knew that she would not choose differently if given the chance. This was her life, their life, and they would face whatever came next together just as they always had. The following morning brought news that would change everything once again. Catherine was having breakfast with the children when William's private secretary entered the room with an urgent message. She could tell from the man's expression that it was serious. William excused himself and left the room, and Catherine continued helping Louis with his cereal, trying to act as if nothing was wrong even as her stomach twisted with anxiety. When William returned 20 minutes later, his face was pale. He asked Catherine to join him in the study when she had a moment. She finished breakfast with the children as quickly as possible, getting them settled with their nanny before hurrying to find William. He was standing by the window again, that same spot where he always seemed to go when dealing with difficult news. She did not need to ask what was wrong. She could see it written all over him. The situation they had been managing, the crisis they had been navigating, had taken a sudden turn. New information had come to light that required immediate decisions and actions. William explained everything to Catherine, his voice steady but his hands shaking slightly as he gestured. She listened carefully, her mind already racing ahead to consider the implications, the choices they would need to make, the conversations that would need to happen. What struck Catherine most was not the information itself, but the realization of how little control they actually had over their own lives. So many decisions were made by others, based on protocols and traditions that dated back centuries. They could offer input, express preferences, but ultimately they were bound by duties and expectations that were bigger than any individual desire or need. It was a reality they had always known intellectually, but feeling it so acutely was different. They spent hours in that study making phone calls and reviewing documents. Palace officials came and went, offering advice and presenting options. Catherine contributed where she could, but she was also acutely aware that this was primarily William's burden to bear. Her role was to support him, to be a sounding board, to help him think through the consequences of various choices. It was a role she had grown into over the years, learning how to be a partner in this unique and demanding situation. By afternoon, they had made the necessary decisions. Now came the harder part: telling the family, preparing statements, managing the inevitable public reaction. Catherine felt the familiar weight settling on her shoulders again, the knowledge that another wave of intense scrutiny was coming their way. She thought about the children, about how this would affect them, about the conversations they would need to have to help their young ones understand yet another shift in their already complicated lives. That evening, Catherine made a decision. She needed to talk to someone outside the palace bubble, someone who could offer perspective without the weight of protocol and duty. She called her mother, slipping away to a private room where she could speak freely without being overheard. Her mother answered on the second ring, and the sound of that familiar voice immediately brought tears to Catherine's eyes. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to truly break down. She told her mother everything, all the fears and frustrations she had been holding inside. She talked about how hard it was to watch William suffer, how exhausting it was to maintain appearances when everything felt like it was falling apart, how much she missed the simpler life they had before all of this. Her mother listened without interrupting, letting Catherine pour out everything she had been keeping bottled up. When Catherine finally stopped talking, her mother offered words of comfort and encouragement that only a parent can provide. The conversation helped more than Catherine expected. By the time she hung up, she felt lighter, more capable of facing what lay ahead. She took a few moments to compose herself, washing her face and taking deep breaths before returning to find William. He was in their private sitting room, staring at nothing, lost in his own thoughts. Catherine sat beside him and took his hand, waiting for him to speak when he was ready. William turned to her with an expression of such profound sadness that it broke her heart. He talked about feeling trapped, about the weight of responsibilities he had not chosen but could not escape. He spoke about guilt, about feeling like he was failing everyone, including himself. Catherine listened, her heart aching for him, wishing she could take away some of his pain. When he finished, she reminded him of all the good they had done, the positive impact they had made, the love they shared with their children and each other. They talked late into the night, having the kind of deep, honest conversation that only happens in moments of crisis. They discussed their fears for the future, their hopes for their children, their commitment to each other and to the roles they had been given. It was raw and painful and necessary. By the time they finally went to bed, exhausted but somehow closer, Catherine felt like they had crossed some kind of threshold together. Whatever came next, they would face it as true partners. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Statements were released, plans were adjusted, schedules were rearranged. The media response was immediate and intense, as expected. Catherine found herself once again in the spotlight. Every move analyzed, every expression interpreted. She had grown somewhat accustomed to this over the years, but it never got easier. The constant awareness of being watched, judged, discussed, it was exhausting in a way that few people could truly understand. Through it all, Catherine maintained her composure publicly while processing everything privately. She leaned on William and he leaned on her. They became each other's anchor in a storm that showed no signs of letting up. There were moments of frustration, times when the pressure felt unbearable, but they kept moving forward because that was what they had to do. Giving up was not an option. not with their children depending on them, not with their responsibilities calling. One particularly challenging afternoon, Catherine was preparing for yet another public appearance when she caught sight of herself in the mirror. For a moment, she barely recognized the woman looking back at her. But then she thought about everything they had been through, everything they had survived, and she felt a surge of determination. She was stronger than she knew, more resilient than she gave herself credit for. She could do this. They could do this. Together, they could face anything. The day of the farewell arrived with a weight that seemed to press down on everything. Catherine woke before dawn, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. She lay in bed listening to William's steady breathing beside her, and tried to prepare herself mentally for what lay ahead. This was the moment they had been dreading, the culmination of weeks of emotional turmoil and difficult decisions. Today everything would change in a very visible, very public way. She rose quietly and went to the window, watching the sky lighten over London. Somewhere out there, thousands of people were already gathering, preparing to witness this significant moment. The whole nation, perhaps much of the world, would be watching. Catherine felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in her stomach, but beneath it was something else. A quiet determination to get through this day with the grace and dignity that was expected of her, but more importantly, with the genuine emotion that the moment deserved. William stirred and woke, immediately sensing her absence from the bed. He joined her at the window, wrapping his arms around her from behind. They stood together in silence, drawing strength from each other as they had done so many times before. No words were necessary. They both knew what this day meant, what it would demand of them emotionally and physically. The schedule was carefully planned down to the minute, but Catherine knew that no amount of planning could truly prepare them for the emotional reality of what they were about to face. Breakfast with the children was bittersweet. Catherine tried to be present, to engage with their chatter and questions, but her mind kept drifting to the hours ahead. George seemed to understand the significance of the day more than his younger siblings, and she caught him watching his father with a concerned expression that seemed far too mature for his age. She made a mental note to spend extra time with him later, to make sure he was processing everything in a healthy way. The morning passed in a blur of preparations. Catherine's team helped her dress, choosing an outfit that struck the right balance between respectful and elegant. Every detail mattered today. Every choice would be scrutinized and interpreted. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman who appeared calm and composed, even if she felt anything but on the inside. The years of training, of learning how to present the right image regardless of her internal state, had prepared her for this moment. William appeared, also dressed and ready. They looked at each other for a long moment, communicating without words all the things they could not say aloud. He reached for her hand and she took it, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become second nature over the years. Together they walked out to face the day, to fulfill their duty, to say their farewell in the way that was required of them. The car ride to the event was tense. Catherine could see the crowds lining the streets, people who had come from all over to be part of this historic moment. Some were waving, others were crying. Many were simply standing in respectful silence. The outpouring of public emotion was overwhelming. She felt William's grip on her hand tighten, and she squeezed back a silent promise that they would get through this together. When they arrived at the venue, the atmosphere was heavy with solemnity. Everyone moved quietly, speaking in hushed tones. Catherine and William took their designated places, surrounded by family and officials. The ceremony began, and Catherine tried to focus on the words being spoken, on the rituals being performed, but her mind kept fragmenting, breaking apart under the weight of emotion she was struggling to contain. She glanced at William and saw that he was barely holding himself together. His jaw was clenched, his eyes glistening with tears he was fighting to hold back. Her heart ached for him, for the pain he was enduring, for the impossible position of having to grieve publicly while maintaining composure. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer comfort, but protocol dictated where they stood and how they behaved, even in moments like this. The ceremony continued, each moment feeling both endless and too brief. Catherine found herself thinking about the past, about all the memories they had shared as a family, about the laughter and the love and the ordinary moments that had made up their life together. She thought about the future too, about how different everything would be from this day forward. about the new responsibilities and challenges that awaited them. Finally, the moment came that everyone had been anticipating. The ceremony reached its conclusion, and it was time for the personal farewell. Catherine felt her composure beginning to crack as she and William stepped forward. This was the moment when duty and personal emotion collided in the most painful way. They had to say goodbye in front of cameras, in front of the nation, displaying their private grief for public consumption. William turned to Catherine, and for a moment, everything else faded away. It was just the two of them, standing together in the eye of the storm. She could see the pain in his eyes, the vulnerability that he rarely showed to anyone else. Her own tears finally began to fall. No longer possible to hold back. This was real. Without thinking about protocol or cameras or what anyone might say, William pulled Catherine into his arms. She felt herself collapse against him, all the strength she had been maintaining suddenly giving way. His embrace was tight, almost desperate, and she held him back with equal intensity. They stood there, clinging to each other while the world watched. Two people finding comfort in each other's presence during the hardest moment of their lives. The hug lasted longer than anyone expected. Time seemed to stop as they held each other, sharing their grief, drawing strength from their connection. Catherine could feel William shaking, could feel his tears against her cheek, and she knew her own were soaking into his jacket. But she did not care about appearances anymore. In that moment, being authentic, being human, was more important than maintaining the perfect royal image. Around them, people began to react. Some in the crowd started crying openly, moved by the raw display of emotion. Others stood in respectful silence, witnessing this intimate moment between a husband and wife who were navigating impossible circumstances. Even the photographers, usually so aggressive in their pursuit of the perfect shot, seemed to pause, perhaps recognizing that they were capturing something genuinely significant. When they finally pulled apart, Catherine looked up at William's face. His eyes were red, his cheeks wet with tears, but there was also something else there. Relief, perhaps, at having finally allowed himself to show his true feelings. Or maybe it was gratitude, for having someone who understood him completely, who shared his burden, who loved him not for his title but for who he truly was beneath all the responsibility and expectation. Catherine reached up and gently wiped the tears from his face, a gesture so tender and intimate that it made several people in the audience gasp quietly. William caught her hand and held it against his cheek for a moment, closing his eyes. Then he kissed her palm, just as he had done countless times in their private moments, but now doing it publicly, showing the world the depth of his love and dependence on this woman who had stood beside him through everything. They turned together to face the rest of the ceremony, hands clasped tightly, presenting a united front. But something had shifted. By allowing themselves that moment of vulnerability, by showing their genuine emotion rather than hiding behind royal reserve, they had somehow become stronger. Catherine felt it in the way William stood beside her, in the collective sympathy and support emanating from the crowd, in her own heart which felt both broken and somehow more whole than before. The remainder of the ceremony passed in a fog. Catherine went through the motions, doing what was required, but part of her mind kept returning to that embrace, to the feeling of William's arms around her, to the knowledge that they had shared something profound in front of the entire nation. It was a moment that would be replayed endlessly, analyzed and discussed, but she did not regret it. Some things were more important than maintaining perfect composure. As they finally left the venue and returned to the car, Catherine felt utterly drained. The emotional toll of the day had left her feeling hollow and exhausted. William looked equally spent, his face drawn and pale. But as they sat together in the back seat, their hands found each other again. That constant source of comfort and connection. They did not need to speak. Everything they needed to say had been communicated in that hug, in that moment when they had let the world see their humanity. The drive back to the palace was quiet. Catherine looked out the window at the people still gathered along the streets. Many were crying, holding each other, sharing their own grief and sympathy. She realized that in showing their vulnerability, she and William had given others permission to feel their emotions too. There was something powerful in that. Something that transcended royal protocol and public relations strategies. They had simply been real, and people had responded to that authenticity. Back at the palace, they went straight to the children. George, Charlotte, and Louis needed them, needed the reassurance that despite everything that had happened, they were still a family, still together, still loved. Catherine gathered them close, and William wrapped his arms around all of them, creating a protective circle of love and support. This was what mattered most, she thought, not the titles or the public duties or the media coverage, but this family they had created together, these relationships that sustained them through the hardest times. That evening, after the children were asleep and the palace had grown quiet, Catherine and William finally had a moment alone. They sat together on the sofa in their private sitting room, exhausted but unable to sleep. William pulled Catherine close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, listening to his heartbeat, letting the familiar rhythm calm her frayed nerves. He spoke quietly about the day, about how hard it had been, but also how grateful he was that she had been there beside him. He thanked her for being his partner, his support, his anchor. Catherine felt tears welling up again, but these were different from the ones she had cried earlier. These were tears of love, of connection, of recognition that despite everything they had been through, their relationship had not just survived, but had grown deeper and stronger. She told him that she would always be there for him, through every challenge, every painful moment, every impossible situation that their unique life threw at them. She reminded him that they were a team, that they faced everything together, that his pain was her pain and his strength gave her strength. He held her tighter, and they sat together in the darkness. Two people who had been tested by circumstances beyond their control, but had emerged with their love intact and their bond unbreakable. The nation had watched them say their farewell, had witnessed their embrace, had seen their tears. The images would be everywhere by morning, analyzed and discussed endlessly, but Catherine found that she did not care about any of that. What mattered was that they had been honest, that they had shown the world that even royals were human, that love and grief and support were universal experiences that transcended titles and protocol. As she finally drifted toward sleep, still wrapped in William's arms, Catherine thought about the journey that lay ahead. There would be more challenges, more difficult moments, more times when the weight of duty felt almost unbearable. But she knew now, more certainly than ever, that they would face it all together. That hug, that moment of raw emotion shared with the world, had somehow crystallized everything she already knew but needed to feel deeply. Their love was strong enough to carry them through anything. Together, they could face whatever the future held, and somehow that knowledge made even the hardest days bearable.